in fan studies here in Brazil. As you guys know, uh, it's a very small field here in Brazil. We're fighting a lot to get our presence made at UFRJ, which is one of the biggest universities, federal universities of Brazil. Some of the students here are from our research group. Others are from other universities in Brazil, and some professors from other universities in Brazil who wanted to be present and hear from you. We will be recording and trying to set up subtitles in Portuguese for uh, people who are not fluent in English so they can watch the lecture later on. Um, and I want to welcome you to our humble abode. We're not that big, but we're very passionate. So you can start whenever you want. Natalia will be responsible for passing the slides for you.
Okay,
And we have a set of questions at the end that people sent us to talk to you about later.
fantastic. Okay, gang. I am so proud to be sharing some thoughts with you today, and I've been so inspired by what Julia has told me about the organization, the network you're building there, and I see great opportunities for us to exchange thoughts now and in the future. So, some of you may, and just before Christmas here, we published the first of what are going to be 15 books via Amazon's self-publishing program about fandom studies. We being Henry Jenkins, myself, and Robert Kosnetz, who is a founding father for ethnography and someone who works in consumer culture research. So the first book came out in mid-December called Defining Fandom. The second book we're finishing up the production on now and hope to get it out within the next 2 months. It's going to be called Fandom as Audience. And we're hoping to come out every 2 months with a new volume until we've completed the full 14 volume set. Each of them will be 150 or thereabouts pages. So today what I'm going to do is talk a bit about the series and about some of the ideas in those first 2 to 3 books, um, to just give you a sense of how I see what fandom studies means to me, what some of its historical roots are, some of the new ideas that are emerging here, and we can talk through any and all of this as we go forward. All right, next slide. So that's me. I'm roughly 10 years old at that time. And both Robert and I begin the books with some autoethnography. We describe our own experiences as fans growing up, and we talk about how the ideas that we have done it through our research and scholarship on fandom took shape. I typically talk about my experience of fandom as a child in terms of Disney, Batman 66, Mad Magazine, and Star Trek. And we do indeed talk about it there. But I also in this book talk about a range of embodied activities. That is everything from playing in the treehouse with my friends to play acting in the backyard to toys that I had. Here we're seeing something that was called Sokies. When I was growing up in the 60s, we did not yet have action figures. But you can see that many of the cartoon characters of that period were represented by these bubble bath containers. And the curious thing is, these are radically different brands from Disney to Warner Brothers to Hanna-Barbera, all released through the same licensing. And if you look closely, on the far left there, you will see that I have Felix the cat's head on Smokey the bear's body. And it suggests the ways we were making substitutions and crossovers. There was a kind of exploration of the relations between these story worlds that would have been a normal part of being a boy child in the 1960s, growing up in that particular culture. And then I talk in the book later about getting my Super 8 camera, doing stage performances of Star Trek episodes, of, recording using an audio tape recorder, the soundtrack of shows that I like to in a VHS, pre-DVD era. We were able to still hold on to and archive the media that mattered to us. Okay, next slide. This is me as a scholar. This is long after Textual Poachers came out, but there I am in my living room at MIT, and I'm holding a batholith, a Klingon battle weapon. And it was a gift from my wife for Christmas one year. I have been played Klingons 3 different times. First as a young fan in high school drama club. Second, as someone in a male in fantasy role-playing game. And finally, as an extra on the set of J.J. Abrams' first Star Trek movie. The Klingons got cut out of the movie, but if you look at the DVD extras, there's one shot of the silhouette of my silhouette looking out over an encampment. You can't tell it's me, but I can tell it's me. Okay, next slide. This is my mentor in grad school, John Fisk. He was the ambassador that brought a lot of the ideas from the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies to Australia, to Canada, and to the United States. And through him, I was exposed to some of the theoretical concepts that would become foundational for the emergence of fandom studies. Next slide. So in the book, across the books, we're trying to acknowledge our ancestors, and one of whom is Raymond Williams, whose work you may know. Raymond Williams wrote an essay in 1958, the year I was born, called Culture is Ordinary. And he was 25 years old. He was challenging his teachers and laying out a new agenda for research, which would become known as cultural studies. And he was sort of arguing that all people have cultures that are important to them. That culture is not just what Matthew Arnold argued, the best that man has created, but is the sum total of human knowledge and human experience. And he was laying claim to the cultures of everyday life, popular culture, as a valid vantage point for which to understand how cultural processes work. And that starts to lay the foundation. He was writing about rural Welsh culture, but it encouraged every subsequent generation in cultural studies to write their own stories about the people they grew up with, the traditions that were important to them. And when I read that in graduate school, it sent me down a process of thinking, well, why not write about fan culture through a cultural studies lens? Next slide. Stuart Hall was a successor of Raymond Williams at Birmingham, who introduced this framework of encoding and decoding, and sort of argued that we need to be attentive to lots of possible ways consumers might relate to media content. He talked about dominant readings, negotiated readings, and oppositional readings. Now, early on, fandom studies often was read as if we were laying claim that fans were oppositional or resistant readers. I can see where that confusion came from, but I want to argue now and reclaim that what fan studies really talks about are negotiated readers. That is, if we were not drawn to the source text, we would not be fans, right? That there's something going on there that provides resources or raw materials which make it possible for us to engage with the text. But if the text fully satisfied us, if we were not in any sense frustrated by the text as it currently existed, we probably would not keep working it and reworking it in the ways that fans are prone to do. So in some ways, what fandom does is negotiate with the core text of the culture around us. Next slide. Janice Radway was another figure in the emergence of fandom studies. She was writing about romance readers as, again, negotiating readers, fans who liked some aspects of the story, but also had a sense of what they wanted out of a book and were often disappointed. And so she talks both about what romance fans enjoyed when they read the romance and also where they were disappointed. Next slide. Dorothy Hobson was one of the first Birmingham scholars to really write about soap operas and she doesn't use the word fans ever. She's talking about followers, she's talking about audiences, but she does what we now might call intervention analysis, where she's making the case that the producers need to listen to their audiences more fully, that the perspective of these fans need to be heard and understood. And so she became an advocate as a fellow enthusiast for a particular British soap, Crossroads. She was advocating on behalf of fans who were angry at some of the decisions producers had made. Okay, next slide. We might also, one of the things that has been said about about fandom studies is has been historically overwhelmingly white. And Rebecca Wanzo did an article about 10 years ago in Transformative Works and Cultures where she says this is all the missed opportunities that if scholars had engaged with race earlier on, there were Black scholars who were writing, not using the word fan necessarily, but writing about things closely related. And one of those was Bell Hooks and her notion of the oppositional gaze, where she's talking about what Black women see when they watch shows or movies or read books that allows them to gain resources that make those stories meaningful in their own lives. And this is a very young Bell Hooks in this picture, about the time that we were both at UW, University of Wisconsin-Madison, at roughly the same time. So we were not classmates, but we could well have been. We were contemporaries in that sense. Okay, next slide. Richard Dyer was doing something similarly around queerness, and his essay that I teach my students, the essay he did about gay men and Judy Garland, sort of does an historical perspective on what it meant to be a closeted fan in the 1950s. And he notes that the Stonewall riots, which have become the landmark for the beginning of the gay rights movement in the United States, took place at the Stonewall nightclub when people had gathered for a wake for Judy Garland. And it was having their wake for Judy disrupted led them to take arm against the police and fight back for the first time. Next slide. We also, one of the books that we're finishing now, Fandom as Subculture, goes back and looks at the Birmingham School work on subcultures and Dick Hebdage's work on the ways subculture members appropriate symbols from the dominant culture and re-signify them, remix them in ways that speak to more marginal groups or oppressed groups, and sees that as the beginning of a new way of thinking about subculture, not as deviance, as the Chicago School had talked about subculture, but as a site of expression and innovation of grassroots cultural production. And that these ideas would become very important as we were sitting down to develop the framework that would become American fandom studies. Next slide. Even more important, though, for us was Angela McRobbie. And McRobbie's essay, Settling Accounts with Subcultures, pushed us forward in two ways. One, she was arguing that the earlier work on subcultures by Habdage, Hall, and others was focused on male subcultures, which were public, spectacular subcultures that occurred in public, where she was arguing women's subcultures tended to take place within the domestic sphere. And she was particularly interested in teeny bopper culture or teen women's fan culture that she said took place in their bedrooms, the places they controlled as their space and their time. So that was one thing. And the second was she was criticizing Hall, Hebdige, and the others for not acknowledging their own positionality, for not calling attention to the fact that they were part of the subcultures they were writing about, but they were claiming a kind of objective, rational viewpoint about them. And she was arguing that feminist politics would lead us to want to talk about our own stakes in the cultures we were studying. And it's out of that critique of Hebdige comes the idea of fandom, the notion that which has been defined in a variety of ways, but in essence means we bring together what we know as fans and what we know as academics, and there are two ways of knowing. It is a kind of epistemology, a way of knowing that the ACAFan stance entitles us to. Okay, next. So this is where I enter the picture. 1992 is often called the year that fandom studies is born. It comes out of audience studies in the Birmingham tradition, a la encoding, decoding. It comes out of the idea of interpretive communities and reader response theory. It comes out of subcultural theory, and in this case, in my case, it's also shaped by the French sociologist and social historian Michel de Certeau's notion of poaching. I'm often called the father of fandom studies, and this is an identity that I reject. I'm proud of my contributions to fandom studies. I am happy to be called a founder, but the last thing I want is to be called the father of what has essentially been a feminist field for most of its history. Right? You don't need, I don't want to be the patriarch of this field. I try to be a strong ally of the women, including, from McRobbie forward, who lay the foundations for it and who are my contemporaries, but I don't want to be seen as a father figure. Okay, next slide. I have nevertheless continued to engage with fandom studies across the full range of my 35-year career as an academic, and these are some of the other books that I've published that speak about fandom participatory culture in one way or another. Next slide. But I would also say 1992 is the year that Enterprising Women by Camille Bacon Smith was published, and her work is every bit as foundational to the field of fandom studies as mine is. And next slide. And Constance Penley's work on Slash and fan erotica and Star Trek and NASA all come out roughly in 92 as well. So there's those three works helped to lay the foundation for something new, which we call fandom studies. Next slide. So what do we mean by fan? In the book, we're making a distinction. A fan is someone who is passionate, creative, sometimes critical, actively engaged around a certain fan object. And we're in the series I'm doing with Rob Kosnetz, we're using fan object in a very broad way because we're trying to map the relationship between brand cultures and consumer culture research and fandom. And so across the books, we're writing about things like, certainly sports, music fandom, media fandom, but also things like Lego and theme parks and, any number of other things that are branded objects. We are at the same time talking about a distinction between fanship, which is the connection between an individual and their fan object, as diagrammed here, and fandom, which is a social collective, a kind of group dynamic where our relations to other fans are at least as important, if not more so, than our relation to our fan objects. So if you go to the next slide, you can see how we've diagrammed this. So next slide. Yeah, here we go. So we see passion and engagement with the fan object, but also a connection to other people who have passion and engagement with the same objects. Now, fandoms could be as structured and as organized as a fan club, an official fan club, or they could be a fan convention, but they also could be a loose network of people, or they could be the members of a family or members of a class. But what we're interested in fandom studies, as opposed to fan studies, is a social dynamic that links the person, the fan object, and the other fans together. That's what makes this fandom studies. Next slide. So we see this not as an absolute. So far, I've been treating it as an either or, but in fact, building on Rian and Burry's work, we sort of suggest that fanships evolve toward fandoms and through a variety of choice points. So enjoying the fan object, discussing it with friends and family, searching for and reading online information, attending a live event, regularly posting at on an online forum, creating and sharing works based on the fan object. Each of those pulls you toward fandom, and rather than the kind of more isolated conception of fanship. Okay, next. So here's our definition. Fandom reflects the collective and participatory nature of media consumption in a network culture. Fanship are fans who consume media with friends, family, and coworkers, but who do not participate in larger fan communities, do not go to fan conventions, participate in online discussions, or create fan works. So we're trying to sort of make that distinction. It's not that we're evaluating one fan against another. We're just trying to be clear on what we mean by the terms here. Okay, next slide. So what fandom looks like then is grounded in cultures. This is a picture of me in Ningbo, China, where I spent some time last summer. I was in the process of learning how to be a good K-pop fan. And my favorite group there is G-Idol. I'd gone to Seoul twice and tried to find a light stick for G-Idol and couldn't find them there. But this woman who was my student is also a G-Idol fan, knew the local fan club in that area, and was able to get and buy for me a light stick. And here she's delivered it to my office there. And we posed for this picture. But the light stick is a particular kind of object that allows us to express our appreciation of the K-pop groups that are important to us. And it's a kind of artifact of the fan performer relationship. Okay, next. The industry tends to divide us into desired audiences, right? And so when they look at a film, they're trying to say, which of these four quadrants are the targeted audience, the demographic that this film is for? And the big blockbusters want to reach as many of these quartiles as possible. So they're divided by gender, they're divided by age. What we find, though, is that in many cases, the most hardcore fans are not the audience the industry desires. They are they're called surplus audiences. By that, I mean, they're not the target. They are a secondary group that may enhance the viewership of something. But, so these might be women who watch science fiction and cop shows that were targeted at men. They may be adults who read children's books. They may be Westerners who like anime. We can go down a long list of these things, but that essentially the hardcore fans are the ones who have to more actively work to negotiate with the source material. It may not have as much of what they want from it, but they're going to build it out in their discussions. They're going to build it out in their fan works. And in doing so, they make it more fully satisfying to their interest. And that's why I go back to this idea that fans are negotiating readers, not resistant readers per se. Okay, next slide. So we use in the book on fandom as an audience the example of Wednesday, the Netflix show, and the ways in which it built on existing audiences around the Addams family, but also around notions like magical schools, which are around Tim Burton or Jenna Ortega's and so forth. But we also talk there about how fans target particular elements of Wednesday and make them pop, right? Wednesday's 10 hours long. Not every moment is equally important to fandom. And here we can look at, this is an Etsy page that shows us how Wednesday dresses. Here, this particular set focuses on the stained glass window that she co-creates with her roommate, who is very glittery and pastel, and she wants black and white. And so this idea of the stained glass window has, over the last year and a half to 2 years, emerged as one of the key icons in the world of Wednesday Addams, right? For musicians, the cello is an important part of that, but less so, I think, within the fan culture at large. Okay, next slide. All right, so yes, the previous one was what it looked like. Go back a pan. So this was within 3 months after the show dropped on Netflix. This next one, if you go forward, is what we see in, if we look at it, Etsy today, we can see that in some ways the stained glass window has become even more central to the fandom. Almost everything you see on Etsy today features that stained glass window. Okay, next. The other big, these are some pictures I took in China at a amateur doll event, DIY doll event. And you'll see that Wednesday cropped up often there, even though the show was not yet officially available in China at that point. These things were inspired by pirated copies, of one sort or another. And they include representations of multiple Wednesdays from different media texts, not simply the Jenna Ortega's version. Okay, next. Here's some more. There's another one that's much more like the comic strip and animated version of Wednesday. Next. Oops, I lost the picture here. Maybe go forward and maybe the next one. They may have gotten shuffled. Nope. Okay, so one of the things that I was going to go back to that last one. One of the things that was, go back one more slide. There. One of the things I was going to point out, although I lost the image for it, is the dance is one of those other points where fan interest really percolated. And we were seeing, especially as the show first dropped, massive numbers of YouTube videos, TikTok videos of people doing the Wednesday dance. And multiple dolls that I saw in China had her in dance poses. So there's a sense that even there, people who were not yet embedded in a fully developed fan culture were already picking up on that as satisfying certain fan interest. On the other hand, the media producers may offer us things we just don't want. So this is the CoverGirl advertising campaign. CoverGirl took Hunger Games and did a series of lipsticks and makeup that reflected the different districts in Hunger Games. Now, it's not clear why, I don't really think of livestock or fishing or lumber as motifs that I particularly want to wear makeup tied to, right? And the idea that these figures that represented poverty and oppression might suddenly turn into glamour girl, makeup just didn't make sense. And so this campaign was quickly terminated when it was very clear that it was getting nothing but opposition from the fan community it thought it could market to. Okay, next. So one of the things we talk, and when we talk about the Stuart Hall encoding decoding, one of the things we move beyond this out, those sort of arrows here are our addition. because we wanted to suggest a feedback loop from fans to producers that's not visible in the way Hall talked about. Hall imagined a one directional thing from the producers who are encoding the text to the fans who are audience members who are decoding it, but didn't include fan production like we included the bottom there, and didn't include the idea that what fans produce could have long term a significant impact on the way the brand or the entertainment property is conceived of by its producers as well. So we're trying to sort of emphasize both the feedback loop and the tension that exist between producers and fans as part of the way we want to tell the story of fandom. Okay, next. So again, thinking about, one of the things we're trying to do is listen to Rebecca Wanzo's call for more attention to race throughout the books and more attention to global fandom across the books. One of my grad students has written her dissertation about Black fans and the Harry Potter universe. And she's noting how few actual fully developed Black characters there are in Harry Potter compared to the number of Black fans there are. And she's describing how fan fiction writers and artists have taken those characters that do exist and given them more fully developed personalities, drawing on them to tell different kinds of stories. And they write it as they sort of come to constitute a Black student union at Hogwarts. And so that becomes the centerpiece of this fan fiction that explores the relationship of these Black characters to each other, and the kinds of things that Black students might want in terms of using magic may be very different than what the white characters that we mostly know from the Harry Potter world is. So they like Harry Potter. They don't necessarily like J.K. Rowling at this point, but they like Harry Potter. But they are pushing back to see changes in that text that better reflect their lived experiences and realities. And in that sense, we are thinking about it as a process of negotiation again. Okay, next line. And as we think about that, then we also want to think about this notion of blurs, which is a kind of Black fan identity. And here we see the founder of Black Girl Nerds, uh, who talks about, she writes, the concept of Black women as geeky, dorky beings is somewhat of an anomaly. It's against the order of things in the Black girl world. We represent a wide array of diverse women who embrace all cultures and refuse to conform to the status quo. It is a term of endearment to all women like me who have been attached to a stigma that is not an accurate representation of my personality or my idiosyncratic behaviors. This is a website for every nerdy girl that can finally come out of the closet and tell the world that they are proud to be who they are, no matter what anyone says, does, or thinks. This is a place where you can truly be yourself and not be judged by others. Many Black girl nerds exist on the planet. This community encourages other bloggers, web creators, and the like to create niche sites such as this one to spread to the world that being a nerd is a lovely thing. So this is a kind of utopian community, a community of shared interest and passion. That is what fans often experience their community as, but not necessarily, right? Rebecca Wanzo and Rukmini Pandey and others have written about the kinds of racism that fans also encounter as they enter into some place like Archive of Our Own or some other fan fiction site, where white fan women don't necessarily understand why there's a desire to include Black versions of these characters or Black stories within their fandom. All right, next slide. In terms of audiences, we could also think about the growing interest in anti-fandom and versus fandom, right? So when I was in grad school, one of my teachers said, you should always write about things you hate in cultural studies because it's the only way to get sufficient distance from them to write about them objectively. Now, a lot of things wrong with that, starting with it, that sounds like a recipe for a lifelong frustration and pain. But beyond that is the fact that hate is not an objective stance, right? And we're now increasingly paying attention to what Jonathan Gray initially called anti-fandom. His new book, Dislike Minded, really takes us a lot deeper into that. But what it is, the kind of passionate connections people have with materials they claim to hate, right? And these anti-fans can be every bit as loyal a viewer of, say, The Bachelor is a place where hate viewing is often a central part of the fan experience. They may be as hardcore as the fans in terms of tuning in every week and engaging in passionate discussions around the source material. It's a different kind of relationship to the fan object, but one that maybe has many more things in common with fandom than differences. Okay, next slide. Also, in the audience book, we go into a bit into transmedia storytelling and the degree to which it assumes a particular set of relationships of fans or viewers to the source material. So no accident that, say, Marvel Cinematic Universe is one of the most fully developed transmedia stories out there. Transmedia just means relationships across media. The idea being that information important to understanding the work is dispersed across multiple media spaces. So Marvel Cinematic Universe may start with comics, but also includes films, may connect to what's happening now on the Disney Channel's versions of the Marvel characters, along with video games or amusement parks or any number of other things. And the fans are bringing that information together from the many different sources and reading them in relation to each other. So one of the companies here in the American media industries, Campfire Media, that does a lot of transmedia extensions, uses its vocabulary of skimmers, dippers, and divers. And skimmers just skim along the top, take in what they can on the first viewing and move on. Dippers go a little deeper, and divers are the ones who are following the rabbit holes and the breadcrumbs and so forth, getting deeper and deeper into it, pooling knowledge, creating new extensions, and so forth. So their argument is that if you create just for the divers, then you're going to have a very narrow but deep and passionate fan base. But if you can learn to create a relationship between those three levels, design stuff so your work can be understood, at least superficially, by a skimmer, but the deeper you dive, the more you're going to get out of it and the more immersed you're going to be in the social community around it. That's the trick, they think, of developing successful transmedia franchises. And whether that's Star Wars or Star Trek or Marvel, this seems to be borne out by any number of examples we can point to. Okay, next. So the book we're writing now is, or refining now, we have rough drafts of all of the 14 books, but right now we're revising and adding more depth to the subcultural book. And the Fandom is subculture book is using as a recurring example what has been called sartorial fandom, fandoms that depend on how we dress as a central mode of expression. The two costumes you see here, one was created by Forrest K. Ackerman and the other by his girlfriend in the late 1930s. And they were their appropriations of things to come, the H.G. Wells, the film based on the H.G. Wells book, Things to Come. And this was believed to have been one of the very first masquerade costumes, not to be worn in the masquerade room, but to be worn roaming the halls of the very first Worldcon, very first World Science Fiction Convention. This is from an exhibit that was hosted at the Art Museum at at USC, which looked at the relationship between science fiction fandom in Los Angeles and the emergence of homophile or queer positive organizations in the city over the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And that it argues that queer people found a home in fandom that they couldn't find in pretty much anywhere else in Los Angeles during that time. And so it was a place where artists gathered and made videos and, published magazines and so forth. And it also was a place where there was a lot of tolerance for alternative sexual identities, experiments with group marriage, any number of other things. And so this exhibit really is reclaiming that history, the connections that existed early on in the 20th century between the emergence of a gay rights movement and the emergence of more and more organized and global fan cultures. All right, next slide. Here again, from my trip to China, this is what a furry looks like in a Chinese context. It's a different set of colors than most of the furries I've seen in North and South America, but it's a beautiful costume. And it was fun to hang out with this young furry fan for a few minutes to get our pictures taken together and so forth. So we write about furries as a different kind of subcultural identity, a kind of sartorial fan culture, which has to do with imagining a persona and buying or building a fursuit to perform that persona that, in its own way, is a critique of certain, dominant cultural institutions and identities. So if we, next slide. Now, at the extreme end of furries have been in recent years Nazi furries. And it's not clear entirely whether they are serious about being Nazis or they're trying to create a joke or what. And it probably varies from case to case. But, when we think about furries, we don't necessarily think about an oppositional fan culture in the way that we could think that Hebdige was writing about punks and teddy boys and so forth. But this is maybe the oppositional end of the furry fan culture. But like much as Hebdige suggests that, say, British punks would take the Iron Cross, which was a deeply offensive symbol to their parents' generation who had fought in World War II, and turn it into a symbol of subcultural affiliation and identity. This also is playing around with Nazi imagery at a time when we're seeing the rise of fascism and autocracies worldwide. The next slide. We talk in the book about also, we do dig deep into Disney bounding. And Disney bounding is really an interesting case where it emerges from Disney's attempt to regulate adults and prevent them from wearing costumes to the theme parks. Disney's idea being that they want to be a clear separation from their employees and other adults who might dress up like the characters and might pose a threat to children in the parks. So the fan community emerged, which tries to use color patterns, abstraction to convey which character they are affiliated with without it becoming a full-on costume. So this woman in the center is named Tiffany. She's featured in a video that the Disney organization now produces, which celebrates her as a Black Disney bounder. And these are a group of her friends who got together and went to the Disneyland dressed like the muses from Hercules as a kind of Black fan outing that follows the rules of Disney bounding. And we go into some length talking about in what sense Disney bounding constitutes a spectacular subculture in the way the Birmingham group was talking about. And I think it's an interesting case because, often there's a sense of threat or danger attached to the subcultures Hebdige wrote about. It's less likely that we're going to perceive it that way here, but there is still a stigma of adults dressing in like cartoon characters and going out into public. That can creep a lot of people out or leave them baffled and confused. And so we're interested in thinking through how we can use Disney bounding to illustrate some of the basic ideas that historically have surrounded subcultures. Okay, next slide. So this is, more and more Disney bounding has become accepted by the Disney Corporation. More and more commercial sites are trying to market to Disney bounders and give tips and advice, base advertising, advertising supported media and so forth. This is from a site, Disney Bound. That's a subcultural site, but this we can see their version of what some stuff you could use to create a bounded version of Rocket Raccoon from Guardians of the Galaxies. Okay, next. We come, as we deal with fandom, we bump up against a kind of challenge, which is that from the very beginning, fandom studies celebrated fan creativity as in relation to cultural appropriation. And we were drawn to the work of Mikhail Bakhtin, who wrote prior to, prior to the moment of appropriation, the word does not exist in neutral and impersonal language. It is not, after all, out of the dictionary that the speaker gets his words, but rather it exists in other people's mouths and other people's context, serving other people's intentions. It is from there that one must take the word and make it one's own. This is the way we've long talked about it in fandom studies, but more and more we bump up against the critique of cultural appropriation, right? And how do we separate out legitimate, creative, innovative, subcultural uses of cultural materials from the exploitation of the creativity of people, of people of color, of the poor, so forth. It's to me not about an absolute division, but about an ethical line that we have to negotiate case by case. And it has to do with the distribution of power. When we appropriate Disney characters and turn them into a Disney bounding, we're individuals like Tiffany are working in relation to powerful corporations that claim to own the rights and to possess and control who gets access to that. When, on the other hand, we dress up like, I don't know, Mexican bandito and a sombrero for Halloween, we may be ridiculing or excluding or marginalizing a group that has very little power. So part of what we're trying to think through in the book on subculture is how do we develop a vocabulary that leaves us alert to the social justice concerns while acknowledging that fandom through and through is grounded in a variety of different forms of appropriation? I'm not sure we've resolved that issue yet. It's something we're still fighting with. So I welcome any thoughts you guys may have, but I think it's important that we find a way to do that because we don't want to give up the power of appropriation and resignification that fandom studies inherits from subcultural studies, but we also don't want to excuse various forms of racism and colonialism that enter fandom and allow for the wearing of, blackface or even blue face, yellow face, whatever, by fan cosplayers who are not acknowledging where these ideas came from. They're not neutral ever. No word is neutral according to Bakhtin. But there are ethical relationships that we have to think through when we're working with these borrowed cultural materials. Okay, next slide. We also in this book talk a bit about hijab cosplay, right? This is a young Muslim woman in the US who won an award at a fan convention by dressing up like Thor, which is, of course, a cross-gender cosplay, and unless we're dealing with brief chapter of Lady Thor in the comics. And it also is a reclaiming of these things for Islamic culture. The hijab is a spiritual symbol. It's the tool of modesty and so forth. And so wearing the hijab while dressing like a Western superhero there's a lot of controversy in the Muslim fan world about this, but also some pushback from Western white fans as well about what this means. But we see it as another example of cosplay as a site of negotiation. Okay, next slide. And when she came back the following year, she brought a lot of her other Muslim girlfriends with her. And so we see here the hijab heroes, a full developed version of the Avengers, all wearing hijab. This is more unusual here in the US than it is in, say, Malaysia or Indonesia or, Kuwait or whatever, where the Muslim is the dominant group there. And this becomes a way that some fan women are allowed to participate in fandom around Western works, even though there's some pushback between the cultures. Okay, next slide. Well, we're also seeing, we also see cross-racial cosplay, right? So that historically cosplayers valued authenticity, how much you look like the original source material. But for fans of color who are underrepresented in mass media, they often have to be more transformative in their relation to the source material in order to open space for them to play around with these characters. And so these are just some examples we've grabbed off the web of fans of color dressed up like superheroes. Okay, next slide. And when I was in China, I started to discover that there we're seeing Chinese fans dressed like Disney characters. These and the ones in the next slide are Snow White, but adapted to native dress. So whether it's the subcultural Lolita dress that's very popular in Japan, or whether it's the Hanfu cosplay of China or the Hanbok cosplay in Korea, that they are redesigning. There's a kind of bounding going on there where people are dressing to evoke the colors and spirit of Snow White and other Disney characters. Next slide. These are beautiful outfits. These are not my pictures, but I did see some equally elaborate examples of cosplay around Disney characters when I traveled around China. Okay. Next slide. Maybe the last one. I can't remember.
This is the last one.
Okay. So those are just, I've just thrown a bunch of things at you to see what sticks, what gets your curiosity, but just as a preview of what some of the kinds of things we're covering in this new series of books that we have coming out. And from here, I'm open to any questions you have about the talk or questions you may have had previously. I'm looking forward to having a chance to change some perspectives.
I feel like there's so much to debate. A lot of the topics you talked about, we've had extensive discourse about it. We have a couple questions that came from students on Instagram and
Okay.
on other sources. I'm gonna allow everyone to send questions on the chat if you want, and I'll read them to Jenkins. The first question is from a lovely girl called Laura. She's a master student in information science at University Federal Fluminense, which is a university here in Brazil. And her research consists of analyzing the representation of book knowledge and how fandom represents it. She read the book Convergence Culture to work on fandom and make a link with fanworks, especially by appropriating the concepts of participatory culture. The final part comes down to analyzing archive of our own tags. And she asks, in your book Textual Poachers, you list a set of textual strategies of interpretation, appropriation, and reconstruction of considered characteristics of fan communities. For example, recontextualization and timeline expansion. Do you think that more than 30 years later, these strategies are still valid for understanding not only how fandom produces, but also how it represents and classifies his fan works?
Well, I mean, fandom is not static, right? And I'm often horrified when people are reading textual poachers to understand fandom today, because I see it as a kind of time capsule of a particular moment in fan history where the zine culture, the print culture, was giving way to a digital culture. And we just happened to capture that moment of transition. That said, so we have more genres of fan fiction today, and we have more access to fan fiction today, thanks to things like Archive of Our Own, than we could have imagined at the time. The scope and scale of it, the global nature of those fan archives become very important. But I would say I don't think any of the forms of fan rewriting that I identified in the book have gone away. Some may be more visible than others, but they're all there and still, and often have been codified into some of the tagging that goes into Archive of Our Own. So, but I think we're seeing more, female slash today. Say we're seeing, there are a variety of other genres like that have taken off, but it's all there.
Okay. In Instagram we opened a question box, and some of them were in Portuguese, so we translated. One of the question is there a distinction between the studies of fan works before and after the age of the internet, and what is the biggest distinction you felt?
Well, I mean, we'd have to start with, there's almost no fandom studies work before the internet technically exists, right? There's articles here and there in a variety of different fields. But 92, the internet is already invisibly coming into fandom, already part of the scholarly world as well. And so the big studies of 92 all assume some degree of digital network culture is starting to take place. But what we couldn't account for is the speed with which that change was going to take place, right? And fandom was a central part. When at the time Poachers was published, women were it was not clear that women were going to be that active a participant in the internet world. It was overwhelmingly male. And fan women are one of the groups that opened the internet to greater female participation. And people were giving old computers to their friends to make sure that they could come online. They were teaching each computing, networking classes to other fan women at cons, that we were printing out discussion posts from the internet and bringing them in big binders to fan gatherings so that people could read and understand the discussions that were taking place. The speed, the scale in which this is taking place and the speed of reaction time just is phenomenal. So in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was watching Star Trek Next Generation, we had what were called letter zines, and you would send your letters and thoughts to a central hub. They would type them all out into a zine, and then 2 months later, you'd find out what other people thought about the episode that you watched last night. But the minute the internet comes in, people are responding while the episodes are still on the air. You could have quite. I was writing about Twin Peaks online, and there was such rich exchanges, massively long exchanges between each episode as they were dropping, and that changes in a fundamental way what fandom was. Now, at the same time, fan scholarship is spreading outward. Communities are networking, they're finding each other online. I found Rob Kosnetz, my co-author in this book. You know, Textual Poachers was out maybe 3 months. He made a reference to it on a post. I was doing an ego scan of the internet, which you could do back then, to see who was talking about me. And I found this guy, we corresponded. I ended up being on his dissertation committee, and we've been collaborators off and on ever since for the last 30, 35 years. So now we're writing a book series together, but it goes back to that moment. I think the Bussier and Hellickson collection were all women who knew each other through sites like LiveJournal, who urged each other to write about their shared experiences, and out emerged, I think, one of the most significant books after the 92 phase, which brought fandom studies forward dramatically. And all of those women, Francesca Coppa, Gail de Kosnek, down the line, these are women who still are leaders in the field of fandom studies. So both on the fan side and on the scholarly side, the internet changed tons and tons about fandom. But there wasn't actually a moment where fandom studies pre-exist the internet. It's just we can't, what we have in those 92 books are those moments of the internet asserting itself into fandom for the first time.
Yeah, we actually interviewed Moonbeam Predilections, who made the fanfiction terminology websites, the by Angel Fire, and she talked a lot about the transition from before and after, and how she sent email letters, and how everything changed after the internet established itself, and the fandom was looking to find a place to settle down as a community, and eventually the birth of AO3. So it was a very interesting interview that I think talked about a lot about the distinction between before and after the internet came upon us. Someone wants to know, a student on Instagram wants to know, I'd like to know if it has already researched some of the impacts of AI on fans' creative expression.
We have some stuff written for the book already on this. I think more is going to be done. I think fandom studies is maybe behind some of the more tech-oriented fields and beginning to look at it. My perspective is, and it's a controversial one, I know that there are people in fandom who will disagree with what I'm about to say, but I think I'm very interested in Midjourney in particular, less so in text-based, but in visually generative AI, and the ways that fans have already begun making works with them that are fabulous work, amazing work. And I see Midjourney is allowing for a democratization of who has the access to the tools of visual expression, right? So my son is a fan and an AI artist, and he was never particularly good at art in school. He doesn't have great hand-eye coordination, nor do I. He's taught me how to do some of the work that I've done using Midjourney and DALL-E and some of the other things. But we see the potential there for new forms of fan expression. Now, where it gets controversial is fan artists, like other artists, are protective of their own work. And I understand that. And it may well be the case that fan artists are less protected than commercial artists in terms of having it scraped and turned into data and remixed by someone else. So I don't think we're there yet in terms of understanding the ethical dimensions of this, and we're not holding the companies that make it accountable for those acts of, ripping people off. But on the other hand, fandom, as I said, has always been based on appropriation and remixing. So I don't understand how someone whose art is grounded in taking images from someone else's media and remixing them can feel too self-righteous about other people building off of what they created, right? It's to me, there's a double standard that I'm often hearing, and I've heard people writing, when I talked about this on Facebook a couple of summers ago, people were saying it's never appropriate to appropriate. And I'm going, no, fandom studies has always been grounded on the idea that cultures grow through acts of appropriation. We need to think the ethics of that, the power relations between it, but we really do need to be able to for fandom to exist, it has to be able to build on cultural materials that are out there. And there's no way that that's going to go on while protecting exclusive rights to your own artwork. So I could go on and on. There's a lot to say
Yeah,
about this,
yeah, that's
but
a very
I think we've got to balance those two concerns.
yeah. We have a couple questions on chat too. I wanted to finish off some of the Instagram questions. One of them is about something that we talked in the lecture, which is the adaptation of characters and how the fandom can feel very protective of a certain image of a character, and it's it's mainly about how much you can adapt a character while remaining true to its original source. So there was a lot of discussion recently with the Little Mermaid adaptation, the movie, and a lot of people
Ah,
were talking about how it doesn't the background of the character only matters if it's important for the story. So if you're taking a character whose cultural background is a part of the essence of the story, then you should keep it. And if not, you should keep only the aesthetic things that make the character nostalgic for other people. So I saw a lot of discussion on Tumblr how, oh, her hair is red, the tail is green, so it's Ariel. It doesn't matter the color of her skin. And I wanted to know what's your thoughts on the adaptation of iconic characters that already have a fandom established and an aesthetic, very iconic aesthetic visual.
well, I think it comes back to some of what I was saying before, that representational politics makes it impossible for us to be democratic and inclusive as fandom and reject the idea that people of color should be able to express themselves through existing cultural materials, right? There are just not enough characters in Hollywood media that are Black, that are brown, that are Asian, that are Native, that, we would be narrowly saying, to an indigenous woman, you can only do 3 or 4 characters because that's all that's out there, and you're stuck with having to do characters that are racist, based on racial stereotypes of what an American Indian person is, rather than redefine them and rework them. So I strongly support the ability of any person to cosplay, to draw any or write about any character they want, but to be respectful of other fans and to be attentive to continuity, to preserve something there that's going to speak to a shared fan community. But I think, the knee-jerk reaction, why don't you make up new characters, doesn't realistically understand that fandom is grounded in pop culture, and right now pop culture is incredibly narrow in its representation. Now we are seeing Disney begin to create new characters. We've seen a variety of Latin American princesses coming in Disney films in the last 4 or 5 years, say. And over time, maybe that's a possible strategy for overcoming those historic exclusions. But in the short term, Disney also has been making new versions of some of those characters, like the Black Mermaid. And if that's not for you, then go back to the stuff you like. It doesn't take anything away from you that you had before. It just opens up space for other groups of people to join the fandom and to identify with those characters.
Perfect. We have Sarah at the chat who asked, I'm a PhD student in information science in UF, which is a university here in Brazil, and I study collecting as an informational fan practice. How do you see collecting in fandoms when compared to other fan practices like fan fiction, fan art, and etc.?
Well, I have to acknowledge that for a long time I ran away from collecting as a topic that I wanted to write about. And indeed, I was so upset with the cover of Science Fiction Audiences, which featured reduced fandom to toys and collectibles, that I threatened to take my name off the book, right? But with comics and stuff, one of my more recent books, I've really come around on this, and I'm very interested in what collecting brings to fandom. So I'm drawn to the work of Daniel Miller, who's an anthropologist who wrote a book called Stuff and another called The Comfort of Things. And he's interested in how we make meaning and map memories onto fit material objects through collecting, right? Collecting is about assemblage. It's about creating a part of our own mythology by the objects we choose to surround ourselves with. He pushes back on the idea that collecting is just materialism. And he would certainly push back on the idea that adults collecting children's toys are somehow infantile or whatever. And his work really helped persuade me that there's something to be paying attention to there. And we have a lot about collecting in book 3 in our series, including I dissect my Christmas tree and the ornaments I have on my tree and the very Spanish ornaments, the different stories I mix and match on my Christmas tree as an example of how we make meaning and manage memory through the collections we construct. Uh, and, we could go down the line. So, yes, I showed you those pictures of a DIY doll convention that I went to in Shanghai. Uh, that's where the line between collecting pre-existing objects and fan creativity starts to blur together, because these people make their own dolls, but they make it out of resources they bought at a hobby shop, but they may use it to explore characters from Mr. Spock to Wednesday Adams that speak to them in one way or another. So I think it's part of the continuum of fandom. I think fans express ourselves in a variety of ways, and collecting is a creative act, not just an act of consumption.
There are some studies I can send you later, but there are some studies we've talked about in our research group about how collecting as a hobby is very common around neurodivergent fandoms,
Yeah,
fandoms that
yeah.
concentrate a lot of neurodivergent people. And as a neurodivergent person who loves collecting, there's certainly a lot to study about how much this hobby brings to the table, to the culture of fandom and fan works, especially. We have a question from Louisa, who's my friend. Uh, I have a bachelor's degree in art history, also at UFRJ, and my final project was about fangirls and misogyny in the arts, and I used your work as a reference. My question is, how important are fandoms for social minorities such as women, the LGBTQ plus community, Black people, people with disabilities, and etc. Thank you so much. Her final project was amazing, and she really talked about uh, uh, how much women matter in arts. So, what do you think?
Well, I think all of those groups have contributed so much to fandom, and the fandom has been, again, going back to this notion of negotiation, a way of these groups that are underrepresented in mainstream media to negotiate a space, a common ground with each other, and to negotiate their stories into the mainstream of popular culture. So I couldn't agree more, and I think that this is really important. The other thing I will say is, if you're into visual studies, that we need more work on fan photography and fan art. There's almost none, and someone who's an art history background can bring a lot. I'm working with a PhD student here at USC whose project is around fandom and photography, and also saw some really good talks at International Communication Association this year on fan photography in the K-pop world. So there's stuff to be done there for anyone who's trained as an observer of art that can make a huge difference. And it sounds like you're starting down that path, and I look forward to seeing what you're producing down the line.
We have a lot of students and scholars here in Brazil who are finding little spaces of parts of the fields that haven't yet been touched a lot and are really interested in studying those fields. So we're trying to instigate those people to not give up, even though it's very hard to get funding or even support from other scholars here, because we're a very traditional country in the sense of literature. We tend to focus a lot on tradition, on what's traditional. So these people who are making papers and studying these things, they have stood up to a certain opposition in the academic field. So it's an applause to everyone who stuck to their beliefs and are still studying these types of subjects, even though we get so frustrated and forced into certain topics here in our community.
Yeah, don't give up. The
Yeah,
first message I'd say. I mean, Brazil has some of the most vibrant music culture, street art culture, folk cultures, and popular cultures anywhere in the world.
yeah,
Every time I go there, I'm just blown away by the passion and energy of pop culture in Brazil. And you should be able to write about things that touch you,
yeah,
whether, you know, and nothing speaks to countries like Brazil more than acclaim from outside. So that if you're doing work that speaks to a global fandom studies community, that may help bring the reputation of this work back to Brazil. And I
yeah,
think that's something worth fighting for. It may not happen overnight, right? It took a while for fandom studies to emerge from those early works in 92 to, I was sort of, there was a lot of pushback on my work when I started out.
yeah,
And But by the time the Bussier and Hellickson book came out a decade later, it was becoming recognized. There was a whole new generation of writers who were building on the work we had done. And it was so gratifying to be reading stuff that was bringing new perspectives and new
yeah.
issues and new theories to bear. And I predict this will happen to you quicker than it happened for us because there is an existing
Hopefully.
field out there. But you just gotta stick to your guns as best you can, and that's easier said than done.
Yeah. I think contemporary, especially contemporary culture, it's very frowned upon here in the academic sense. A lot of students from our research group, including myself, Leticia, who's another coordinator, Natalia, are struggling a lot to find masters, to apply to masters here, because there's just not a lot of diversity in topics. And but we're still stuck into it. And we have a question from uh, Giovanna. My name is Giovanna. I finished my master's degree last year at UFMS, Universidade Federal do Mato Grosso do Sul, and my dissertation theme was a case study about a K-pop group named ATEEZ, and
Mhm.
their fandom dynamics surrounding the fictional narrative they built through their content. Can you talk a bit about your thoughts on participatory culture and transmedia storytelling surrounding K-pop and K-pop fandom? I'll even bring out BTS as one of the groups that does this a lot throughout music videos and albums. They tell a fictional story with characters and stuff. So this is a very interesting topic.
No, well, I'm very actively interested in K-pop and Hallyu fandom more generally. I'm trying to raise some money to support a center at USC for K-pop studies. And I think we've got maybe our first million committed now, so this may actually happen. But yeah, I mean, I think we have to decide what we mean by participatory culture. Certainly on a social dynamic level, uh, groups of people in Seoul and around the world really have embraced this music and made it part of their social identity. We can look at K-pop fashion. We can look at, when I go to Seoul, I've been to, coffee houses where fans
Photo
hang out, and
cards.
photo cards collecting would be another dimension. There's all kinds of pieces of this thing. Now, complicating this is that in East Asia, the manufacturing culture is so strong that fans there often commission work to be made for them rather than DIYing it. So in America, if you went to talk about cosplay, you went to a cosplay convention, it would be all about how you made your own costumes, right? And how you worked with leather or metal or work or whatnot. In China, I went to multiple cosplay events in China where the celebrity guests were all models and actresses who played parts, but their costumes were made for them by the production centers there, and at very low cost. You could get a really nicely made fan costume for under $100 there. And so there was no reason, if it could get exactly to their specs made better than someone else, they were not making it. They were participating in fan fiction writing, they were making fan videos and so forth, but cosplay per se was not a participatory phenomenon in quite the same way. Um, so I think there's a lot we still don't know. I think that there's a different set of values and idol cultures in Asia than here. One of them is the fan economies, right? For most of its history in the US, fandom tried hard not to make money off of other fans, right? Amateur produced works sold at cost. And there was almost a kind of fan socialism that emerges there in the US as fans just are some of the sharpest critics of profiteering. In China and Korea, on the other hand, one of the biggest ways to be a fan is to spend money, right? And so there's a kind of fan capitalism in China that and a fan socialism in the United States, which sort of either way it queers the economic relationships that we normally associate with those countries. And I think we need more work on fan production capacities, fan economics to fully deal in a commensurate way between what participatory culture means in the US versus what it means in the major Eastern Asian countries.
Yeah, we have a study from a student in our group who's been studying the past year about the persona, the idol persona in K-pop, and how it translates to the adaptation of this persona and characters to fan fiction,
Yeah,
especially
yeah.
in real person. It's a very interesting study. She did an amazing text that will be published this year. So we have a lot of interest in this area specifically. If you get tired or you need
I'm
to,
doing okay. I need to
okay,
leave at 3, no later than 3, but you've got me up
N-
until then or less if
no,
you need
no
less. But
problem. So 3 o'clock is around 8 here, I believe. So okay, we need
yeah,
to do the
so it's 2:24 at the moment, so we've
okay.
got 2/3 of an hour left still.
Perfect. Uh, Joanna asked, my final dissertation was about death of the author and fandom. I studied your work in college through the Convergence Culture book, and only later I found out about fandom studies. So thank you so much. It made writing my dissertation in the middle of a pandemic much more bearable. My question is, what are your thoughts on the growing loss of physical objects like DVDs and games?
Well, I hope they're not going away. I attempted to carry the laptop to the other room and show you my massive comics and DVD collection. Because I really believe in holding on to material media. As a kid, I fantasized about owning a film library, and now I have thousands of films in my collection. Why would I go back to streaming where I don't control what happens to that material? I am committed as a collector of DVDs and other media. So I'm a collector through and through. Um, what else was I going to say? I've lost my train of thought. Sorry. Um, it may come back to me, but yes, I do believe in the importance of archiving, fan archivist, and Gail DeKosnik's book Rogue Archives is strongly recommended for anyone who's interested in that dimension of it. It's a whole book-length study of fan archives, their practices, their importance in related fields, and so forth.
Perfect. We have a question from Sarah. I'm a master's student in literature studies at UFPE, and my question is if you would consider fanfiction as a form of queer reading and rewriting practice, since it's subversive and it's mostly written by and for marginalized people. Besides, does it make sense to say that fan fiction is not only fan work and entertainment, but also a form of survival and fighting an oppressive system?
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I mean, when we first started writing about slash, and what in Asia is called BL, right? Those genres were understood initially and framed as, why do straight women write about gay men? But it was within the first 5 years of fandom studies, it was clear that they started on entirely the wrong premise, right? That it was not, in many cases, people who had been closeted when I began writing textual poachers had come out of the closet by the time I wrote science fiction audiences, say. And more, it's clear today that a high percentage of fan fiction writers are queer in one sense or another. They may be, ace, they may be trans, they may be bisexual, whatever. There's a variety of forms of queerness. And part of what I think and makes this interesting to think about is the degree to which those categories and labels are still pretty rigidly enforced in, say, GLBTQ plus or activist groups. But in fandom, they are completely blurred, because what you're trying to do is learning to communicate across sexualities as more of a fluidity, where we're using shared bodies. We may be writing about two male characters from a TV show, but we're mapping our own sexual desires, our own, fantasies onto them. And it creates a space where we can come together and talk across different sexualities. And so I think the word queer is the right one, right? It's a continuum of queer possibilities that fandom embraces, that sets it apart from, at least historically, a lot of the organizations that grew out of the gay rights movement, where, we have that escalating number of initials that we talk about because we can't agree on, the coexistence of these groups, that they're not able to communicate across, whereas fandom does. And I think that's maybe one of the more important contributions fandom makes for a queer politics, or a gender non-binary politics, a gender fluid politics, which, we now we're continually having to examine our writing. The words we used in the past are no longer adequate for that, but what's remained consistent is this is a space for sharing erotic fantasies with people whose sexuality may not be the same as yours, but who share a common fan object.
Yeah, we even made a a quick research in our campus where we put out a form for students to fill out at university about what fan fiction changed, how fan fiction changed their lives. And most of the responses has something to do with finding out your own sexuality, discovering different types of sexualities because of fan fiction, or neurodivergent people figuring out different types of neurodivergencies because of fan fiction. So definitely the representation that we are able to have within fan works helps a lot of people find themselves during their childhoods and
Oh, absolutely.
teenhoods. Yeah, it's very important for everybody, I think, in this lecture. We have a question from Giovanna. I'm a film major student, and I want to write my final dissertation on the consumption and reproduction of dad's dove in erotic fiction. And I have special interests in studying sensible content in different types of media. My question is, what do you think about people who write or consume contents about themes like rape, incest, and pedophilia? especially in these times of the rise of neoliberal, conservative, misogynistic, and racist groups? And do you think there should be a limit to what people can produce or consume?
I am absolutely a libertarian where it comes to censorship or regulation of human expression. I think we need to be able to tell those stories. You may want to code them so that people who don't stumble on them unaware that that's what they're going to get, right? And that's where Archive of Its Own has created its coding system that is not 100%, and people sometimes maliciously don't code their stories. But I think that in general, fans cooperate in protecting each other from reading stories they don't want to read while allowing each other space to share fantasies that are important to them. I think we often want to do things in our fantasies we would never act on in real life. And someone like Laura Kipnis's book on pornography really lays this out, that the assumption that someone who fantasizes about rape wants to be either a rapist or wants to be raped is simply not the case, that it's often about, it's about other things that's going on when people write those stories. Similarly with incest, I doubt very many of the people writing and reading incest stories are necessarily engaged in incestuous relationships. They are exploring some other dynamics that seem important to them. They may have been sexually abused and need to work their way through it. It could be part of a healing process. So I think I'm not sure. I've yet to read the fan story that I felt crossed the line that required me as a cis white male to regulate it or restrict it in some way. That's not my place. And I think what excites me about fandom is most of us get that, and most of us are willing to allow a more permissive environment around those stories. Now, this does become a challenge if, in a world which is more and more reactionary, that if people find these stories online, how are they going to respond? And there's a risk, a risk for the person writing the story, a risk for the people reading the story, and potentially a risk for fandom at large. But I think fandom ceases to be fandom when it values, so frightened by that risk that it loses touch with its acceptance of diverse forms of fantasy and erotic expression.
Couldn't agree more. I love this topic. We've discussed this so many times. Um, we have Laura. She's a PhD student in English literature at UFMG, and she studies adaptations of Shakespeare's works and fan communities around them. I would like
Hmm.
to ask you to talk a bit about how fan works can transform the way people approach and understand these kinds of canonical texts that are often introduced to us through ready made readings.
Well, I mean, I'd start with the fact that Shakespeare takes many of his characters from other
Yeah,
people's plays.
yeah.
So on that axis, I won't say they're fan works. The category of fan doesn't exist then, and therefore it would be ahistorical to call those fan works, but they parallel fan works. They're iconic works, to use Gail de Kosnick's term, and as our works throughout history. Homer was an iconic writer who took the relations between Achilles and Patroclus, his shield bearer, which had always been in Greek culture understood as a romantic sexual relationship, and he straightens out those characters in the Iliad. So the sense that these writers pull stories in all different directions and build on each other's stories. There's also some good historical work that says that people were writing plays in response to Shakespeare's plays while they were being produced in Elizabethan England. And so Shakespeare had fans. Again, that's an archaic, it's a word that was not yet in use, but people who were writing amateur fiction based on the characters of his plays. And in some cases, in the case of some wealthy people, they could be produced even on stage. So what was, the thing missing from that dynamic is the notion of intellectual property. which is what gives fandom today a particular charge, is the fact that some people are claiming ownership over stories and characters that in an earlier time period would have been widely available to be rewritten. Now, I do think that fandom in general is a way of building up literacies, ways of critically engaging with text and citing most fan stories cite various kinds of evidence. They're making a creative argument rather than a critical argument, but they are nevertheless using the act of retelling in order to critically engage with works. And so, yeah, I firmly believe in the educational value of this. One of my books, Reading in a Participatory Culture, grew out of a project we did around Herman Melville's novel, Moby Dick, which is often considered the great American novel. There are a couple of other candidates for that, but and and it grew out of me meeting this Black theater artist who had gone into prisons and worked with incarcerated youth, many of whom were there because of their involvement with street gangs, and got them to read the book closely. And this is a book that most schools don't teach anymore in the US because it's seen as too difficult. And get these kids who are several grade levels below the reading capacity of their peers, but read it closely in order to rewrite it and had them draw up characters of who those, studies of who those characters would be if they existed today. And it ended up creating a play, which we helped produce several times, that was about Ahab as the leader of a street gang in the drug trade. The great white thing is not a great white whale, but cocaine and the cocaine cartels. And it was a very powerful way of connecting what was whalers as a dangerous possession on the outskirts of society in the 19th century with the experiences these young men had today. And so we use that as the foundation for designing curriculum, which we've tested in schools and so forth, that look at remixing practices as part of how we might study literary text. So it's probably my least well-known book. Didn't kind of got orphaned by the press and didn't get read by that many people, but it is my effort to precisely build on fandom to think about literature, the instruction of literature.
We have two more questions and then we can finish it off. I have a question from Ana Julia. She's a student at UFPE and she's studying fan fiction. She wants to know, which ways do you think fan studies in Brazil can take, having in mind that Brazilian fans are often perceived as very engaged and passionate, in some ways way more than other country fans? I think that's a common stereotype that has some truth to it,
Mhm.
that Brazilian fans are very intense.
Well, you've met my friend Mauricio Mata, who
Mhm.
we worked together running a conference maybe 10 years ago, where we brought a lot of Brazilian artists to MIT to talk about fandom there and what it might bring to cultural industries around the world. And a lot of the discussion was on Creative Commons. A lot of it was on, fan funding models that were being applied in Brazil well before they were anywhere else. So that's one dimension. Talked about fan economics earlier, that there's distinctive kinds of fan economics at play in Brazil that I think we and the rest of the world could learn from and learn about. But secondly, I think the particular racial dynamic of Brazilian culture makes it a particularly rich site to think about fandom and race in new ways, right? I said at the beginning that Rebecca Wanzo's piece really and the work of Rukmini Pandey and others have really pushed the field to say, we need to be paying more attention to race. It is possibly the most urgent topic in fandom studies today. I'm working hard on my part for these books to bring more racial diversity and global diversity into fandom studies, but you guys are there on the ground with a different configuration of racial categories, and I would love to see work that really made a Brazilian contribution to our understanding of race and fandom. I could keep going. I think Brazil's a fascinating country. I've been there 6 times. I'm overdue to get back there, but I'm a big fan of Brazil.
Whenever you come, you have to call us, because we
Absolutely.
will
Not a
make a
chance I
space for
would come
you.
without it.
We will make a space for you at university, and you see how many people show up and appreciate the work that you do. It's very important to us. I wanted to finish it off with a question of my own. um, it's the only thing I separated for today, and it's me and Natalia. We are working in a very important project, which we took inspiration from the fanfiction terminology from Moonbeam Predilections, and we're studying the history of terminology and the vocabulary the fandom created as a community, especially after AO3 was born.
Mm,
We have
mm.
some before, but after AO3, we really had this massive uh, uh, wave of terms that came upon us, that evolved from one term to another until it became a certain there's a certain consistency to the vocabulary. And we're trying to create a dictionary that an etymological dictionary that talks about the history of the terms and which terms connect to it throughout the history of fanfiction. And what I wanted to ask is about canon. Canon is a very important term in fanfiction culture. And we study fanfiction as a literary genre, in a sense, a type of literature. And we talk a lot about canon as canon compliance, canon divergence, and alternate universe, and how we define canon and fanon in within fan fiction. And I wanted to know your opinion on uh, the the dictation of canon in fiction. So in a sense, how the fandom takes priority to dictate what's canon and what's not, even in implicit things. So, for example, within a fiction story, you have a start, a middle, and an end, and everything that's explicit in that context is canon. But there are some discussions about interviews with authors and actors and people who talk about characters. Is that canon? Is the point of view of someone who has a certain authority of the text or the media important for the definition of canon? Did that make sense? I'm
It
sorry,
does.
I got a bit
I'm trying to
nervous.
think about how to answer it because I don't see it as my business to tell fans how to use words. I think
Yeah,
it's great to reclaim those usages. And yeah, this is a theoretical and conceptual debate. If we're going to see, you know, we've seen an explosion of the presence of the author in recent years
yeah,
through transmedia, right?
yeah,
So making of commentaries on DVDs and so forth means we have access to more of the thinking process behind the works we like
yeah,
than ever before. When I was growing up, we had the making of Star Trek and a couple of books around Star Trek, but that was it compared to the range of making of materials we have today. And fans absolutely are studying those materials. And, you know, and when you have, I'm thinking about Babylon, not Babylon 5. Shit. Okay. Any case, uh, you have authors who are commenting hours and hours on podcast about every episode of the
yeah,
show and saying, well, this is what we were trying to show there, and this is another direction we didn't get to go, or the series got canceled here, but we were going to go here, here, and there, and we were going to show you this, this, and this. That becomes part of the story, the shared mythology.
yeah,
So I think there are plenty of circumstances where that stuff does become part of the canon. On the other hand, I think fans have long been willing to be skeptical of claims by authors to determine what does and doesn't matter in their own works,
yeah,
right? To tell us what things mean. We tell you what they mean. We tell you which scenes matter to us, which character relationships are important, and so forth. So, this is something that fans have to resolve for themselves. What part of that speculation is binding and in what sense, on whom, under what circumstances? And what's rich about fandom is that willingness to throw out any and all part of the canon that gets in the way of their own storytelling.
yeah,
That the willingness to rewrite the sexualities of characters, the races of characters, the genders of characters. The most fundamental information is up for grabs. And if a fan can tell a story that's compelling while changing those aspects that we may have once thought were fundamental to the character, then more power to them. And that's the creative power of fandom. And ultimately, the fan is the one who determines what's canonical and what's not,
Yeah.
not the creator.
Yeah, that's what makes it hard to define canon as a term in itself. And it's my favorite thing. I want to research it so bad. Um, I wanted to finish off today thanking everybody who came. A lot of us are finally getting some form of a vacation, or or a little bit of time to rest after the school year finished off. And yet, so many people still appear today to watch the lecture. And I wanted to thank you for coming and for
Oh,
giving
my
us the
pleasure.
chance. We're fighting a lot here. We're trying to make something important and something to help create a space for fan studies here in Brazil, for fandom studies here in Brazil. So your support and your time that you dedicated to us today is very important to inspire the students to keep going, to fight for what they like, to study the things that made them who they are, that they grew up with. So it's very important to us, your presence here. I really wanted to thank you. If you have any last words for the students and professors and scholars here today.
Well, I go back to Raymond Williams, who says, write about the forms of culture that matter to you.
Yeah.
It's not about hierarchies and, canons in the literary sense. It's about exploring the parts of culture that touch your life and touch your heart and your brain, and using that to ask some fundamental questions about the society around you. And that's what's made fandom studies what it is today. And I can't wait to see great work coming out of Brazil that helps me to better understand what fandom looks like in the context of your culture.
Yeah, we're doing what we can. And anybody who needs help with research and studies, our research group is open for anybody who needs help, who needs content, who perhaps needs a bit of guidance. There's always one of us, one of the coordinators available on Instagram and on Tumblr to answer your questions. And we will be trying to make this lecture available with Portuguese subtitles as soon as possible. We have some volunteers to translate the lecture for us, but we can't promise anything too fast. We're trying, so we'll make it available as soon as possible. I hope everybody has a great week, a great weekend, and happy holidays, even though they're over. And thank you again, Henry, for your time and your the presentation in itself was very good, very informative for us.
Well, I was happy to do it and happy to do it again sometime. So let's find ways to stay in touch by all means.
Yeah, we have projects coming this year. We will call you, we will invite you, and whenever you're available, we will contact you, okay?
Okay. Take care.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.
Obrigada, gente. Tchau, tchau.